There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a life when everything that once held it together is gone. Not the peaceful kind of silence, not the kind you choose on a Sunday morning with a cup of coffee and nowhere to be. This is the silence that fills rooms after funerals. The silence of a phone that no longer rings with the voice you most needed to hear. The silence of an empty chair at a kitchen table set for two. Margaret Callahan knew that silence better than she knew almost anything else by the time she drove her 2009 Honda Civic, the one with the cracked passenger mirror and the driver's side window that only rolled down halfway, along Route 9 toward a place most people in Milford Creek, Pennsylvania, had stopped thinking about entirely. She was 58 years old. Well, her hair had gone mostly silver in the 3 years since Daniel died, though she had stopped noticing it somewhere around the 2nd anniversary of his passing, when she had also stopped noticing a great many things. The lines around her eyes were deep and earned. Her hands, gripping the steering wheel that October morning, were the hands of a woman who had worked 2 jobs for going on 31 months without a single week off. Grocery cashier, Monday through Friday, 6 in the morning until noon. Office building cleaner, Tuesday through Saturday, 9 at night until 2 in the morning. In between, 4 hours of sleep, a sandwich if she remembered, and the quiet arithmetic of a woman who checks her bank balance before she checks anything else every single morning. She owed the hospital system $178,400. That was the number left over after Daniel's life insurance. The smaller policy, the one they could actually afford, had been applied to the larger bill. 18 months of treatment, specialist after specialist, a clinical trial in Baltimore that had required her to take unpaid leave for 6 weeks. She did not regret a single dollar of it. She would have spent twice as much, 3 times, everything she had ever saved over 30 years of careful living. She had done exactly that, and then some. The foreclosure on their house in Greenfield had finalized 14 months after Daniel passed. She had seen it coming for long enough that it had stopped feeling like a crisis by the time the papers arrived. She had moved into a 1-bedroom apartment on Mercer Street, small but clean. She kept it very clean. Her daughter Claire, who lived in Portland with her husband and their 2 young boys, called every Sunday. She always offered to send money. Margaret always said no. Not out of pride exactly, though there was some of that. More out of the conviction that Claire had her own life to build, her own children to raise, and that a mother's job, even a mother who was tired down to the marrow, was not to become her children's burden. That was where things stood on the morning Margaret Callahan turned off Route 9 onto a narrow county road she had never driven before, following directions she had written out by hand on a folded piece of notebook paper, because her phone's GPS tended to give up in areas where the signal grew thin. She was going to look at a toll house. She had found the listing 3 weeks earlier, on a bulletin board at the Milford Creek Public Library. Of all places. She went to the library every Wednesday afternoon. It was warm, it was free. And the librarian, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Fitch, never asked her why she stayed so long, or why she sometimes fell asleep in the reading chair by the periodicals. On this particular Wednesday, she had been walking past the community announcements board near the entrance when a yellow sheet of paper caught her eye. County tax lion auction? Properties, it read. Residential and commercial parcels with delinquent tax histories. Open bidding. Starting bids from $1. She almost kept walking. She had no business buying property. She knew that. She had roughly $412 in her checking account and about $60 in cash in the envelope she kept in the kitchen drawer, and she was not a woman in a position to be speculating on real estate. But something made her stop, read the list anyway. There were 11 properties, mostly vacant lots, a condemned duplex, a storage unit with a collapsed roof. And then, near the bottom of the page, listed almost as an afterthought, Harwick Toll House, 1847 stone structure, Harwick Road, unincorporated Milford Township. Former toll collection station, Harwick Turnpike, decommissioned 1924. Approximately 680 square feet main structure, 0.4 acres. Condition: poor. Delinquent tax assessment, $4,247.11. Starting bid, $1. She had not heard of the Harwick Toll House, but she tore the bottom corner off the yellow sheet, the part with the auction date and the county office phone number, and slipped it into her coat pocket. That night, after her cleaning shift, she sat at her kitchen table at 2:30 in the morning and looked up everything she could find about the property on her phone. It wasn't much. The county assessor's website had a single entry with a blurry satellite image that showed a squat stone building half swallowed by vegetation, surrounded by wild grass and a stand of old oaks, set back from a road that looked barely wide enough for one car. The structure's outline was clearly original: thick stone walls, a low roof line, but the photograph had been taken from enough altitude that the extent of the damage was impossible to gauge. She found one other reference, a short paragraph in a local historical society's online newsletter from 2011, describing the Harwick Turnpike as one of the oldest private toll roads in the county, some built by a man named Augustus Harwick in the 1840s to connect the inland farming communities to the river markets. The toll house had been the collection point at the road's western terminus. When the turnpike was absorbed into the county road system in the early 1920s, the toll house had passed into private hands, specifically the Harwick family, who had built it and apparently never fully let go of it. The last owner, she eventually learned by calling the county office the following morning, had been a man named Edmund Harwick IV, great-great-grandson of Augustus. He had lived alone in the toll house for nearly 40 years, growing more reclusive with each passing decade, until he died in the spring of 2019 with no known heirs, no will, and 4 years of unpaid property taxes that had sat accumulating interest while the estate moved through the county's intestate process. The county had been trying to dispose of the property ever since. 2 developers had walked through it. Both had declined to bid. The structure had significant foundation concerns, the county official told her. A partially collapsed roof section on the north side, water intrusion throughout, and what a contractor had described as extensive organic deterioration of interior floor systems, which, Margaret understood, meant the floors were rotten. "Has anyone expressed interest?" she asked. "Not seriously," the woman said. "There was a salvage company that called about the stone, but they backed out when they got a look at the removal costs." Margaret thanked her and set her phone down on the table. She sat for a long time looking at the satellite photograph she had pulled up again on her screen. The stone walls of the toll house glowed a faint amber in the overhead light, thick and old and enduring. The roof dipped on one side. The vegetation had crept up around the foundation, but the walls stood. After 176 years, the walls stood. She thought about Daniel. She thought about the way he used to say, whenever they passed a falling down old farmhouse or a derelict church on one of their Sunday drives, someone built that to last. Shame nobody remembers it. He had been a man who believed in things that were built to last. He had built their marriage that way, careful and solid, and meant to hold. She reached for the torn piece of paper in her coat pocket and smoothed it flat on the table. The auction was in 11 days. She did not tell anyone she was going to bid on it. That was a decision she made consciously and without guilt. She knew exactly what would happen if she told her sister Patricia, who lived 40 minutes away in Carterville, and who called every few weeks with a combination of genuine concern and low-level judgment, that Margaret had learned to endure the way you endure weather. Patricia would say what Patricia always said. "Maggie, you can't afford to dream right now. You have to be practical." And she wasn't wrong, technically. Patricia was almost never technically wrong. She had a nice house and a reliable husband and a sensible, practical life. And she'd been watching Margaret make what she considered to be impractical decisions since they were children. Marrying Daniel, a high school art teacher, and not a doctor or a lawyer, had been one. Moving to Milford Creek instead of staying closer to family had been another. And this, Margaret knew, would top them all. So she said nothing. She went to the county tax office on the morning of the auction, a Tuesday, her day off from the grocery store, wearing her good gray coat, the one she kept for interviews and funerals. And she sat in a folding chair in a municipal room that smelled of old carpet and fluorescent light. There were 9 other people in the room, most of them looking at their phones or at paper lists of the properties. A man in a canvas jacket near the front appeared to be a developer of some kind. He bid aggressively on the first 3 properties and won 2 of them. A young couple, nervous and excited, won the vacant lot on Greer Street for $140. Though when the county auctioneer, a tired-looking man who read from a printed list with the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery receipt, reached the Harwick toll house, there was a brief, uncomfortable silence in the room. "Harwick Toll House," he read. "1847 stone structure, Harwick Road. Starting bid $1. Do I have $1? The man in the canvas jacket looked at his list, made a small mark, and set it down. No one raised their hand. $1, the auctioneer said again, glancing up. Margaret raised her hand. $1 to the lady in the gray coat. Do I have 2? She looked around the room. The man in the canvas jacket was already looking at his phone. The young couple were whispering to each other about something else. The remaining bidders had the air of people who had already made their decisions. "For $2, the auctioneer said without much hope. "Nothing." "I'll do 8, Margaret said. The auctioneer looked at her. $8? $8, she said. It's my lucky number. He looked around the room one more time. No one moved. $8. Going once. Going twice. He brought the gavel down. Sold. Harwick Toll House to the lady in the gray coat for $8. She wrote the check with hands that trembled slightly, though she kept them pressed flat against the table so no one would notice. She also signed the assumption agreement for the $4,247 in back taxes to be paid in 24 monthly installments of roughly $177. That was the part that actually cost her something. But she had done the math in the 11 days between finding the listing and sitting in that folding chair, and she believed, she had to believe, that she could manage it. She drove home alone and sat in her car in the parking lot of her apartment building for a long time before going inside. She was the owner of a 176-year-old stone toll house in a condition described by county officials as poor. She had paid $8 and assumed nearly $4,300 more in debt. She had no renovation budget, no construction experience, and no clear plan. She also had, for the first time in 3 years, something that felt, tentatively, cautiously, like purpose. She told Patricia on a Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks after the auction. They were sitting in Patricia's kitchen with cups of tea, and Margaret had been intending to bring it up naturally, to work toward it gradually. Instead, she said, out of nowhere, "No, I bought a property." Patricia set her cup down. "You what?" "A toll house. Historic. 1847. Stone construction." She said it quickly, the way you rip off a bandage. "I paid $8 at a tax lien auction, plus I'm assuming some back taxes. Monthly payment isn't bad." Patricia stared at her for a moment. Then she said, "Maggie, you're working nights cleaning offices. I know that. You have medical debt. I know that too. You live in a 1-bedroom apartment on Mercer Street. Patricia, I'm aware of my circumstances." Her sister pressed her lips together in a way that Margaret had seen 10,000 times across the span of a lifetime. It was the expression that preceded a careful, reasonable, devastating assessment. "What are you going to do with a falling-down toll house?" "Fix it up." "With what money?" "I'll figure it out." "And then what?" "Live in it?" "Maybe. Or sell it. Or rent it. I don't know yet." Patricia picked up her tea again and looked out the window. When she looked back, her expression had softened slightly, which was almost worse. "Honey," she said, with a gentleness that carried the full weight of worry, "you can't afford to gamble right now. You just can't." "It wasn't a gamble," Margaret said quietly. "It was $8. She did not tell Patricia that the real gamble was continuing to do exactly what she had been doing, working herself to exhaustion, paying down a debt that felt like a permanent condition, never looking up, and expecting something to change. That kind of gamble didn't feel like one because it was familiar, but it was still a bet. It was just a bet on staying still. Her neighbor Dot, a retired school teacher who lived across the hall and who had a gift for appearing in the corridor at exactly the wrong moment, heard about it somehow, likely through Patricia, who, despite her reservations, had apparently mentioned it to their cousin Linda, who knew Dot from the garden club, and stopped Margaret one morning on her way to work. "I heard you bought some old wreck of a building out on Harwick Road," Dot said. She was a small woman with large glasses and the directness of someone who had spent 30 years managing 8-year-olds. "I bought a toll house," Margaret said. "Same thing." Dot tilted her head. "Why, what in the world are you going to do with it?" "Restore it." Dot looked at her, the way people look at someone who has said something technically grammatical, but semantically baffling. "By yourself?" "I'll start by myself." "Maggie," Dot said, with the particular patience of someone explaining something obvious to a person who has momentarily forgotten the obvious. "That place has been empty for years. I drove past it once. Lord, the roof is caving in. The weeds are taller than I am. Whatever's inside is probably rotted through." "Probably," Margaret agreed pleasantly. Dot shook her head slowly. "Well," she said, in the tone of someone washing their hands of the matter, "I hope you didn't spend too much on it." $8, Margaret said. Dot blinked. Then she said, "Well, that's something, I suppose," and went back inside her apartment. The man at the local hardware store, when she came in to ask about stone mortar and basic weatherproofing, heard where the property was, and shook his head with the weary authority of a man who has seen many projects undertaken by people who had no business undertaking them. "That old toll house," he said. "Couple of developers looked at it a few years back, walked away. Foundation's a mess from what I hear." "I'll start with the roof," Margaret said. He rang up her supplies, a tube of caulk, some plastic sheeting, a box of heavy-duty staples, without saying anything else. But she noticed him watching her through the window as she loaded the bags into her car. The expression on his face was not unkind. It was something closer to the look people give someone they expect to fail and feel sorry for in advance. She had seen that look before. She had seen it in the eyes of the hospital billing coordinator, who had explained her payment options 3 years ago in a voice calibrated for someone who needed very bad news delivered gently. She had seen it in the face of the bank officer who had processed her foreclosure paperwork. She had learned, over the course of a very difficult 3 years, that the look itself was not the problem. The problem was only if you believed it. She did not believe it. Not entirely. Not yet. She drove out to the Harwick toll house for the first time as its owner on a Saturday morning in early November, when the sky had that particular flat, gray quality that meant rain later, but not yet. She turned off the county road onto Harwick Road, little more than a gravel track now, the edges grown over with high grass and the remnants of a split-rail fence, and followed it for a quarter mile until the oaks closed in on either side and the toll house appeared ahead of her. She stopped the car and sat looking at it for a moment before she got out. It was smaller than she had imagined, and more imposing at the same time. The stone walls, thick, hand-laid limestone that had been fitted together by people who knew what they were doing and intended the result to outlast them, rose to about 12 feet at their highest point, solid and gray and streaked dark with a century of weather. The roofline was intact over most of the structure, but on the north side, the right side as she faced it, a section had clearly given way. On the edges of the broken boards visible from where she stood, a ragged gap that let the sky in. The vegetation had been thorough and patient in its work. Vines had climbed the north wall to the roofline and begun working their tendrils into the mortar joints. The overgrown path that must once have been the main approach was barely distinguishable from the surrounding grass. An old iron gate, corroded to a deep rust red, hung at an angle from a single remaining hinge at what had been the property boundary. Beyond the gate, near the rear of the structure, the outline of what might once have been a small outbuilding, a stable perhaps, or a storage shed, was visible as a low stone outline, mostly swallowed by grass. She got out of the car. The air smelled of cold stone and damp earth and dead leaves. Oh, and something underneath all of that. Something older, harder to name. Not unpleasant. Just the smell of a place that had been alone for a long time. She pushed the gate open carefully. It resisted, then swung with a long, grinding complaint of rust on rust. She walked up the overgrown path to the heavy wooden door, or what remained of it. The door itself was intact. Thick oak planks, original hardware, a wrought iron latch that had gone black with age. She lifted the latch and pushed. The door opened slowly, swollen with decades of moisture, groaning on its hinges, and the smell that came out to meet her was the dense, complex smell of a closed space. Old wood, old stone, the faint, sweet rot of things that had been wet and dried too many times, and underneath all of it a faint mineral sharpness, like struck flint. She stepped inside. The main room of the toll house was a single, low-ceilinged space, roughly 30 feet by 20, with walls of the same limestone that formed the exterior. The original purpose of the room was legible in its bones. A toll booth was essentially a transaction space, a place where a collector sat to receive payment from travelers passing through, and the architecture reflected this with a long, narrow window along the road-facing wall, now missing its glass, and a broad, heavy counter built of dark wood set into the wall opposite the door, its surface worn smooth by a century and a half of hands. The floor beneath her feet was flagstone, large, irregular slabs of dark gray slate, fitted together without mortar but with a mason's precision, the joints between them tight and even. She tested the nearest slab with her boot. It was solid. Whatever had happened to the wooden floors of the living quarters visible through a doorway to her left, the flagstone in the main room had held. She moved carefully, testing each slab before she committed her weight to it. Most were firm. Two near the far wall shifted slightly when she stepped on them, not dangerously, but enough to notice, as if they had been disturbed or lifted at some point, and reset not quite as perfectly as the original work. Through the doorway to the left was what had been a small living space, a room where the toll collector had, presumably, slept and cooked and spent the long hours between travelers. This was where the damage was worst. The floorboards here were wooden, and they had not survived as the flagstone had. Several had collapsed entirely, leaving gaps that showed the dark earth below. Others bowed and creaked under the slightest pressure. She did not venture far into that room. She stood in the main space for a long time, simply looking. Light came in through the road-facing window and the gap in the north roof, falling in cold, flat sheets across the flagstone floor. Dust moved slowly in the light. The thick walls held the chill like a held breath. She thought about what this room had been, the transaction point of an old road. People had stopped here, handed over their coins, and passed through. Travelers, farmers, merchants, the whole turning world of a young country in motion, pausing for a moment at this stone threshold, and then going on. And then the road had changed, and the travelers had stopped coming, and the toll house had been left behind by the larger movement of things, preserved, in a way, by its own irrelevance. She understood that feeling. She pulled her notebook from her coat pocket and began to write down what she saw. Roof, section collapsed north side, maybe 12 to 15 feet span. Exterior walls, sound, some mortar deterioration. Main room floor, original slate flagstone, mostly solid. Living quarters, wood floor collapsed, needs full replacement. Window openings, glass missing throughout, need boarding or glazing. Door, intact, hardware original, needs rehinging. She stood in the middle of the flagstone floor and turned slowly, looking at each wall in turn. There was something in this room that she couldn't quite name yet. Some quality of the space itself. The walls were thick enough to muffle the world outside entirely, standing in the center of the room, when she could barely hear the wind moving through the oaks beyond the gate. The quiet was almost absolute, not hollow, not dead. Expectant, in the way that certain old spaces are, as if they have been waiting and have grown patient enough not to show it. She went back to her car and sat with the heater running for a few minutes, reviewing her notes. Then she drove to the hardware store and spent $63 on weatherproofing supplies, a heavy-duty padlock for the door, and a box of disposable dust masks. She had her first task. She would seal the broken roof section against the coming winter. Everything else could wait for spring. But the building needed to be protected first, whatever it held, and she suspected it held more than it showed, the way certain people hold more than they show. It needed to survive the winter intact. She began going out to the toll house on Saturdays. The drive was 40 minutes each way. She brought a thermos of coffee and whatever she could eat in the car, because there was no heat inside the structure and no way to make any until she had addressed the roof, and she worked through the morning and into the afternoon until the light failed or her body said enough. The roof section was her first serious project, and it humbled her thoroughly. She watched 3 YouTube tutorials on temporary roof repair before she felt confident enough to climb up there, and even then, the first attempt, stapling plastic sheeting over the gap, lasted exactly 1 week before a wind pulled the edges free, and she arrived the following Saturday to find it flapping uselessly against the stone. She started over, this time using heavier sheeting and running the edges under the surrounding shingles rather than over them, sealing the perimeter with roofing tape and weighting the whole thing with salvaged boards. That held. Small victories. She had learned to take them where they came. With the roof section protected, she began the work of clearing the interior. It took 4 Saturdays to haul out the accumulated debris from the living quarters. Not just the collapsed floor sections, but the generations of things the previous owner had stored and forgotten and let rot. Cardboard boxes so old the contents had merged with the cardboard itself. A metal bed frame, a porcelain sink fixture, stacks of newspapers from the 1970s and 1980s, their pages fused together by moisture into soft, illegible bricks, a wooden wardrobe that had slowly melted into the floor over decades of damp, its joints giving way until it was no longer a piece of furniture, but an arrangement of related boards. She cataloged what she found as she worked, methodical as an archaeologist. The layers of habitation, the toll collector's era, the built-in counter, the iron hardware, the flagstone. Then the Harwick family's successive occupancies, wallpaper in patterns from 3 different decades, visible where it had peeled apart in layers. Then Edmund Harwick, the 4th's long, solitary tenancy, which had left behind the particular debris of a reclusive life. Functional items with no ornamental purpose, nothing wasted, nothing acquired for pleasure. Work boots, a kerosene lantern, tins of preserved food, long since expired, a stack of ledger books whose handwriting was dense and small, and which she set carefully aside in a dry corner, not yet ready to read them. She found, tucked into a recess in the stone near the old counter, a small framed photograph, its glass cracked and its image faded almost to nothing. She could make out 2 figures standing in front of the toll house, the walls behind them recognizable, the gate visible at the edge of the frame. One figure was tall, formal in a dark coat. The other was smaller, a woman in a long dress, her face turned slightly away from the camera as if she had moved at the last moment. On the back of the frame, in handwriting that had faded to a pale brown, Augustus and Clara, 1889. 42 years after the toll house was built, the founders, or their descendants, still standing in front of their stone creation. She set the photograph on the windowsill, where it could catch the light. In the 3rd week of her work, She began to pay closer attention to the flagstone floor. She had crossed it hundreds of times by then, rolling the wheelbarrow back and forth through the main room, moving debris from the living quarters out to the pile she was building at the edge of the property for eventual removal. She knew the floor well enough by then to navigate it in dim light, knew which slabs she could trust and which required a moment's hesitation. It was on a quiet Saturday in late November, when the sky outside had the white, pressurized look that meant snow before evening, that she noticed something she had not allowed herself to fully register before. She was pushing an empty wheelbarrow back through the main room, and she stopped in the center of the space to adjust her grip on the handles, and she looked down at the floor around her feet. The flagstones were, as she had known from her first visit, large and carefully fitted. But she had assumed, without really thinking about it, that the fitting was uniform throughout. Looking now more carefully, she saw that it wasn't. The slabs in the center of the room were laid in a pattern slightly different from those along the edges. Not dramatically different. Not different in a way that shouted at you. But the joints between the central slabs were slightly wider. The edges of those particular stones showed a different kind of wear. Not the wear of foot traffic, which rounds and polishes the surface, but something that looked more like the wear of repeated contact at the margins, as if those particular stones had been moved more than once and reset. She left the wheelbarrow where it was and crouched down, running her fingers along the nearest joint. The stone was cold under her palm. She pressed lightly. No movement. She shifted to the next joint. Same. Then to the one between the two slabs at the center of the room. The two that, now that she was down at floor level, she could see were very slightly raised at their edges compared to the surrounding stones, as if something beneath them was exerting the faintest upward pressure. She pressed her palm flat against the larger of the two. She felt nothing, or almost nothing. There was, at the limit of sensation, below the cold of the stone and the slight roughness of its surface, a very faint quality to the sound the slab made against her hand when she tapped it lightly with her knuckle. Not hollow, exactly, but different from the neighboring stones, less resonant, as if what was beneath it was not earth. She sat back on her heels and looked at the two central slabs for a long time. The snow began outside, gentle and indifferent, filling the road-facing window with white. She told herself it was probably nothing. A different substrate beneath those particular stones, a layer of packed gravel or old fill that had settled differently over the decades. These were 176-year-old floors in a building that had seen a great deal of use and a great deal of neglect. Variations in the subfloor were to be expected. The slightly different wear at the stone edges could be explained a dozen ways. She told herself all of this with considerable conviction, and yet she remained where she was, crouched on the cold flagstone, her palm still resting lightly against the surface of the central slab, listening to the snow fall outside and to the absolute, waiting quiet of the room around her. Some part of her, the part that had driven 40 minutes each way for weeks, the part that had stood in the county office and written a check for $8 and signed her name to an assumption agreement for a building everyone else had walked away from. That part of her wasn't convinced by the reasonable explanations. That part of her was paying attention. She took out her notebook and made a new entry. Central floor slabs, 2, possibly 3. Edges showed different wear pattern, different acoustic quality when tapped, Investigate when I have the right tools. She closed the notebook. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, and the light through the window was the thin, flat light of a winter afternoon running out of time. She stood up, brushed the stone dust from her coat, and looked around the room one more time. The thick walls, the old counter, the photograph of Augustus and Clara on the windowsill, and the floor beneath her feet, with its faint, unnameable secret. She picked up the wheelbarrow and went back to work. But that evening, driving home through the snow with the heater on and the wipers working steadily across the windshield, she found herself thinking not about the roof or the collapsed floor in the living quarters or the mortar that needed repointing along the north wall. She was thinking about the sound a stone makes when you tap it, and the difference between the sound of earth below and the sound of something else. She was thinking about the two central slabs and the way their edges wore, and about a man named Edmund Harwick IV, who had lived alone in that stone building for 40 years and died without a will, and without, apparently, a single person who knew what he had left behind. She was thinking about what it means when a floor that has stood for 176 years keeps a secret. The snow fell steadily, and the road ahead was white and quiet, and Margaret Callahan drove home through the dark with the careful, a deliberate attention of a woman who has learned not to dismiss the things that won't let her go. The following Saturday, she brought a pry bar. She had not planned to use it. She had brought it in the back of the car along with her usual supplies: fresh weatherproofing tape, a can of stone sealant, a new pair of work gloves, telling herself that she was simply keeping her options open. That if the morning's work brought her back to the main room, and she happened to have a pry bar available, it would be foolish not to examine what she had noticed the previous week more carefully. She spent the first 2 hours of the morning on the legitimate work. She resealed the roof section where the tape had lifted at one corner. She applied sealant along a section of the north wall's exterior where the mortar had eroded to a depth she found concerning. She cleared another load of debris from the living quarters and stacked it outside. Then she went back inside and stood in the center of the main room, looking at the floor. The light was better today. The sky had cleared overnight, and winter sun came through the road-facing window at a low angle that raked across the flagstone surface and revealed its topography in a way that overhead light never would. In that angled light, the difference between the central slabs and the surrounding floor was more visible than she had realized. The wider joints were clear. But there was something else she had not seen before: a slight discoloration along the edges of the two central stones, a thin dark line at the margin where stone met stone, as if oil or some other sealant had been worked into the joint deliberately, long ago, to keep them in place or to keep something beneath them from escaping. She crouched and ran her fingernail along the joint. The material in the gap was not the same as the dirt and dust that filled the other joints. It was harder, darker. It had the quality of something applied intentionally. She picked up the pry bar. The first stone, the larger of the two, resisted her initial attempt. It was heavier than she expected, and the pry bar found no purchase in the tight joint until she worked it along the edge, until she found a spot where the gap was marginally wider. She applied slow, steady pressure. The stone moved. Not much, perhaps 1/4 of an inch, but it moved, with a low, a grating sound that was not the sound of stone on stone. It was a sound with more resonance to it, more depth. She stopped. Her heart was doing something it had not done in a very long time. Not the elevated beat of physical exertion, which she had grown accustomed to in weeks of hard work, but something less controlled. Something closer to what she had felt at 24 years old, standing outside the church on the morning of her wedding, when the future had been large and unknowable and wonderful. She set the pry bar down and pressed her ear close to the gap she had created. Cold air rose from below. Not the cold of earth, not the steady mineral cold of the ground in winter. Something cooler than that. Something that carried a faint metallic quality on the edge of it, dry and mineral and contained. The cold of an enclosed space, a sealed space. She straightened up and looked at the floor around her, at the walls, at the old counter, and the window, and the photograph on the sill. She looked at the ledger books she had stacked in the corner weeks ago without reading. She looked at the floor again. 176 years this building had stood on this ground. 100 years since it stopped being a toll house. 40 years of a solitary old man living here alone, and then dying here, and leaving behind nothing but these stones and whatever lay in the silence beneath them. Her hands were not shaking. She noted this with a kind of distant surprise. She felt very calm. She felt the particular calm that arrives when something you have been moving toward without knowing it finally comes into focus. And the only question left is whether you are ready to see it clearly. She picked up the pry bar again. She worked the edge of the first stone carefully, methodically, the way she had learned to do everything difficult in the past 3 years, without hurrying, without forcing, trusting the steadiness of sustained effort over the drama of sudden force. The stone rose slowly, its weight considerable, and she worked a second bar, the smaller one she had brought as an afterthought, under the opposite edge to keep it from settling back. When she had raised it far enough, she slid it to one side. Beneath was not earth. Beneath the flagstone was the surface of something man-made, a fitted iron plate, dark with age, and sealed at its edges with what looked like some kind of compound, poured in and hardened over decades until it was fused with the stone around it. It was roughly 4 feet across. In its center, barely visible beneath a layer of settled dust, was a recessed handle. She knelt on the cold floor of the toll house and looked at what lay beneath the stone that had been sealed there by human hands at some point in the long history of this building. Outside, the winter sun moved through the bare branches of the oaks and laid long shadows across the overgrown path to the gate. Margaret Callahan, 58 years old, widow, cashier, office cleaner, owner of a forgotten toll house purchased for $8, knelt on the cold floor and looked at the iron plate beneath the stone and understood, with a clarity that did not require drama, that her life had just changed direction. She did not yet know what was beneath the plate. She did not know what the cold, dry air rising from the sealed space below contained, or what a reclusive old man and the generations of his family before him had hidden beneath the floor of a stone building on a decommissioned road in an unincorporated corner of Pennsylvania. She only knew that she had come here because something would not let her walk past it. That she had driven 40 minutes each way for weeks and climbed onto a damaged roof and hauled debris in a wheelbarrow through the cold and crouched on a flagstone floor listening to the way things sound when you tap them. And now, she was here, and the door beneath the floor was waiting. She reached for the handle. The handle was cold in a way that went beyond the temperature of the room. It was the cold of something that had not been touched in a very long time, the kind of cold that accumulates in the dark the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of still water, slowly, without urgency, over years and decades. It was a recessed ring of iron, roughly 4 inches across, set into the surface of the plate at the center, and it was stiff when she pulled it. Not locked. Stiff. The stiffness of disuse, of metal that had contracted through too many winters and expanded through too many summers, and been asked to move by no one for long enough that it had settled into its position as a permanent condition. She pulled harder. The ring lifted perhaps half an inch, then caught. She held the tension for a moment, steady, not forcing it, and felt the slight give as the seal around the plate's edge began to yield. A faint cracking sound, like old wax giving way, like the skin of something long shut beginning to open. She maintained the pressure. Another crack. Then the plate shifted, and the cold air that had been pressing up through the gap of the moved flagstone now rose in a slow, deliberate exhalation, as if the space below had been holding its breath for years and could finally release. The smell was extraordinary. She had expected earth, mold, the usual smell of enclosed underground spaces, damp and organic and slightly rotted. What she got instead was something mineral and dry and faintly metallic, with an undertone she could not immediately name. Old paper, perhaps. Old cloth. The particular smell of things that have been sealed away from air and moisture long enough that they have settled into a kind of suspended state, neither decaying nor living, simply waiting. She lifted the plate. It was heavier than it looked, perhaps 40 pounds, and she had to brace her feet against the floor and use her legs rather than her back to work it clear of the opening, sliding it onto the flagstone beside her with a sound that rang off the thick stone walls. She straightened up, breathing hard from the effort, and looked at what lay beneath. A shaft, perhaps 3 feet across, lined with the same limestone as the walls above, the stones fitted with the same meticulous care as everything else in this building. A short iron ladder, its rungs bolted into the stone at regular intervals, descended into the dark below. Then at the bottom, perhaps 10 feet down, she could see, faintly, in the thin winter light that fell down through the opening, the edge of something. A floor. Stone, from what she could tell. And on the floor, arranged with an order that was visible even in dim light from this distance. Shapes. Rectangular shapes. Stacked. Row on row. She stood at the edge of the opening for a long time. Then she went to her car and got her flashlight. The ladder was sound. She tested each rung before she committed her weight to it, the way she tested the flagstones above, methodically, without rushing. The iron was cold through her gloves. She descended slowly, one rung at a time, her flashlight hooked to her belt so her hands were free, the beam swinging with each step and throwing moving shadows off the stone walls of the shaft. Her feet found the floor at the bottom, and she stood still for a moment, adjusting to the space. It was a vault. The word arrived in her mind with a kind of quiet inevitability, the way the right word for something arrives when you have been approaching it for long enough. Vault, an underground chamber, stone-walled and stone-floored, deliberately constructed, deliberately sealed. She could see from where she stood that it was roughly the same dimensions as the main room above, a square space of perhaps 20 feet by 20, with a ceiling low enough that she could almost touch it by raising her hand. She unhooked the flashlight and swept the beam slowly around the room. The orderliness of what she saw struck her before anything else. This was not a space where things had been thrown or hidden in haste. Everything had been placed. The rectangular shape she had glimpsed from above were stacked against the far wall. Low stacks, too high in most places, organized in rows with channels of perhaps 18 inches between them for access. Each object was wrapped, gray cloth or canvas, bound with cord that had dried and stiffened over the years, but remained intact. The rows of wrapped objects extended nearly the full width of the far wall, perhaps 15 feet, and the stacks were deep, she counted, sweeping the beam from left to right. 7 rows visible. She moved the light to the side walls. On the left wall, a series of wooden shelves had been built into a recessed section of the stone. Crafted, not purchased, the joints tight and the construction careful. The shelves held smaller objects, also wrapped, also bound, arranged by size. At the end of the shelving, on a wooden cabinet with iron hardware, old, beautifully made, stood against the stone. Its doors were closed and latched. On the right wall, more shelves, these holding what appeared to be flat cases, perhaps a dozen of them, stacked horizontally. Leather exteriors, aged to a deep brown, their surfaces dry and slightly cracked, but essentially intact. In the center of the room, nothing. A clear space. An aisle. As if whoever had arranged this space had anticipated that someone would one day stand here in the center and look, and had left room for that looking. Margaret Callahan stood in the center of the room and looked. She held the flashlight steady, though her hand was not entirely steady, and she took slow breaths of the dry, mineral-smelling air. And she looked at row after row of carefully wrapped objects arranged along the walls of a stone vault that no one had opened in. She did not know how long. Years. Decades, possibly. Long enough for the seal on the iron plate to fuse with the surrounding stone. Long enough for the cold to settle in and stay. She walked to the nearest stack at the far wall. The wrapped object at the top of the first stack was about the size of a large book, perhaps a foot long, 8 inches wide, 3 or 4 inches deep. It was heavier than a book, significantly heavier. She picked it up with both hands, and the weight shifted to her palms with a density that was immediately, unmistakably familiar, even to someone who had never held one. Because that particular density, that specific ratio of mass to volume, is one that the human hand recognizes instinctively, the way the hand recognizes extreme cold or extreme heat, without needing to be told what it is. It was the density of gold. She set it back in its place very carefully. She stood looking at it for a moment, then looked at the row it sat in, then at the row behind it, and behind that, and the rows on either side, running down the length of the wall. She had done a great deal of reading in the week since she first noticed the different wear on the central flagstones. Not because she had been certain she would find anything. She had not let herself be certain of that, had held the possibility at careful arm's length so as not to build her hopes into something that a simple investigation would collapse. But she had read about the Harwick family and the history of the toll house and the economics of private turnpikes in 19th century Pennsylvania, and about the man who had built this building. Augustus Harwick had been, by the accounts she found, not only a road builder. He had been a man of considerable wealth by the standards of his time and place, a merchant who had diversified into infrastructure at a moment when the country's appetite for internal improvement was generating fortunes for anyone positioned to supply what was needed. He had built the turnpike with investors' capital, and paid them back, the historical record suggested, somewhat selectively. The wealth that accumulated in excess of his obligations had apparently been managed with the same private, undeliberate character that defined everything else about the Harwick family's relationship to the world. They had not trusted banks. This was a fact that the Historical Society's newsletter had mentioned in passing, citing an 1887 letter from Augustus Harwick to his son William, in which he wrote that a man's surety in this world is the same as his surety in any other transaction. It must rest on something he can put his hand to, and know is real. Paper cannot be put in the ground and trusted to stay there. Certain things can. She understood now what certain things meant. She understood, standing in the vault beneath the toll house with her flashlight and her work gloves and her cracked passenger mirror and her $412 checking account. What a man who did not trust banks had done with the wealth accumulated over a lifetime, and the lifetimes of the business partners and family members who had contributed to and inherited his philosophy. He had put it in the ground, and the ground had kept it. She did not open any of the other wrapped objects that day. She looked. She moved through the space slowly, the flashlight's beam exploring each section of the shelves, each stack along the far wall, the wooden cabinet, the leather cases on the right wall. She noted everything she could see without touching. The organization of the space, the care with which it had been arranged, the sense present in the construction of the shelves, in the ordering of the stacks, and in the exact placement of the leather cases, that whoever had built and maintained this vault had done so with the intention that it should be used, should be returned to, should be managed as a functional space, rather than simply sealed and forgotten. Edmund Harwick IV had known this was here. She was certain of that in the way you become certain of things that align with everything else you know. He had lived above it for 40 years, alone, reclusive, without heirs, or without heirs he had told anyone about. And then he had died, quickly enough, or with enough confusion at the end, that he had not, or could not, tell anyone what was below the floor, or had chosen not to. That possibility settled in her mind as she climbed the ladder and came back up into the light of the main room, and she sat on the old counter for a long time with her flashlight in her hands and the iron plate gaping open in the floor and the cold air still rising from below. And she thought about that. She thought about a solitary old man in a cold stone building on a road nobody used anymore, sitting above a vault that held what she was beginning to understand was an extraordinary amount of wealth, and choosing not to tell anyone, not filing papers, not leaving a will, not calling a lawyer or a grandchild or a charitable organization. She thought about what it means to keep something, to hold it past the point of usefulness, to become so accustomed to a secret's weight that you stop being able to imagine life without it. She understood that, too, in a quiet way she did not examine too closely. She called no one that day. She replaced the iron plate, levered the flagstone back into its position as best she could, packed her tools into the car, and drove home through the early dark of a winter Saturday. And she did not sleep well that night. On Monday morning, she went to the library and asked Mr. Fitch, who received the request with his customary soft-spoken equanimity, for whatever he had on the valuation and authentication of precious metals and historical artifacts. He found her 3 books and showed her 2 database resources. She spent 4 hours reading. What she learned, distilled to its essentials, She could not know what she had without having it assessed. She could make educated guesses based on the weight and dimensions of the objects she had handled, but educated guesses were not knowledge, and she was not in a position to act on anything less than knowledge. The assessment needed to come from someone who could not be casually dismissed, a credentialed professional with the documentation to support their findings. She needed an appraiser. She called the County Historical Society first, and a pleasant woman named Helen Marsh listened to her describe the property and suggested she contact the State Historic Preservation Office before doing anything else, and then said, in a tone that was helpful but not encouraging, "If you found artifacts of potential historical significance, you'll want to have an attorney present when you have them assessed, for your own protection." Margaret thanked her and made a note. Attorney. Add to the list. She called 3 attorneys before she found one willing to see her the following week. A woman named Renata Voss, solo practitioner, whose office was in a small building above a dry cleaner's on Route 12, and who specialized in estate and property matters, and who had, she said on the phone, handled a few unusual property situations in her career. She did not tell Patricia. She did not tell Dot. She went to her shifts at the grocery store and the cleaning company, and she said nothing to anyone. And each night, she sat at her kitchen table with the light on and the window dark, and she worked through the reading she had been doing, building a picture from facts, the way you build a structure from stone, one piece at a time, checking each one carefully before placing the next. And she also called the county assessor's office and spent 20 minutes asking careful questions about the legal ownership and disposition of objects found on property acquired through a tax lien auction. The woman she spoke to was helpful, but cautious. "You'd want a lawyer's input on that," she said twice. Margaret agreed and thanked her, and hung up. She was already getting a lawyer's input. She was getting all the input she could, from every direction, because she had spent 3 years being a person to whom things happened, and she had made a decision, somewhere between the library bulletin board and the folding chair in the county auction room, that she was done being that person. Renata Voss was a small, sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, with the organized desk of someone who had learned early that disorder costs time, and the manner of someone who charged by the hour and was not interested in wasting yours or hers. She listened to Margaret's account of the discovery, with her hands folded on the desk and her expression professionally neutral. When Margaret finished, Voss was quiet for a moment. "You haven't opened the other wrapped objects," she said. "No." "You haven't told anyone else?" "No." "Good." Voss leaned back slightly. "Here's what you need to know. Pennsylvania has a clear framework for property found on land you legally own. If the property was concealed by its owner or their estate and has remained on the land, it generally belongs to the landowner. The complication arises if the objects were stolen from a third party, or if there are competing claims from heirs. Given that the previous owner died intestate, and the county has completed the disposition process, the latter is less likely, but not impossible." "Could the county claim it?" Margaret asked. "Their claim would be limited. They sold you the property in a tax lien auction. The property includes what's on and under the land. However," Voss held up one finger, "you will need documentation. A formal inventory and appraisal conducted by a credentialed professional with a written report. You'll need to file a discovery notification with the county clerk, which establishes the timeline and your legal claim. And you should not remove, sell, or dispose of any of the found objects until we've completed those steps." Margaret nodded. She had expected all of this. No, who do I call for the appraisal? There are certified appraisers for precious metals and numismatics, coins and bullion, and separate ones for historical artifacts and fine objects. You'll need at least 2, possibly 3, depending on what you have. Voss looked at her directly. "How much do you think is there?" Margaret looked back at her steadily. "I don't know exactly, but it's a vault roughly 20 feet square, and the far wall is covered in stacked wrapped objects of the size and density you associate with gold bars. The shelving holds smaller objects and what look like cases, possibly coin collections or documents. I'd estimate the stacks alone." She paused, because even now, days later, the numbers she had worked through in her careful nighttime reading seemed too large to say aloud in a clean, lit office. "I'd estimate potentially hundreds of objects, possibly several hundred." Renata Voss's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted. "All right," she said, in the tone of a woman adjusting her priors without letting it show on her face. "Then we need to do this correctly. Let me make some calls." 3 weeks passed before the assessment could be arranged. 3 weeks during which Margaret drove to the toll house on Saturdays as usual, continued her weatherproofing and debris clearing, and said nothing to anyone about what lay beneath the floor. She had told Renata Voss. She had told no one else. It was the hardest 3 weeks of the whole year, and that was saying something, because the year had contained some hard weeks. Patricia called on the first Sunday after the discovery. "How's the project going?" she asked, with the careful warmth of someone trying to be supportive despite their reservations. "Making progress," Margaret said. "It must be a lot of work for one person." "It is. Maggie, you know, if you need help, I could come out sometime, and I'm fine, Patricia. Truly." A pause on the line. Then, "You sound different." "I'm tired. I've been working hard." "Not that kind of different." Another pause. "Like you're keeping something." Margaret had always found it difficult to lie to her sister. They had grown up too close for it, sharing a bedroom for 15 years in a house where privacy was a courtesy rather than a right. She had developed, over those years, a technique that was not quite lying, the selective truth, the accurate statement that redirects without deceiving. "I found some things in the building," she said. "No, objects left by the previous owners. I'm having them assessed." "Objects? What kind of objects?" "Historical. I don't know the full picture yet. That's why I'm having them assessed." Well, Patricia processed this. "That's interesting, I suppose. Could be worth something, maybe? Even just for the Historical Society." "Maybe," Margaret said. "I'll let you know when I know more." She set the phone down and sat at her kitchen table for a long time in the yellow light of the single overhead bulb, and she was not sure if what she felt was peace or its temporary cousin, the quiet before something large arrives. The appraisers arrived on a Thursday in January. 3 of them, arranged by Renata Voss, who was also present, along with a county clerk who had come to witness the formal discovery documentation. Margaret had taken a personal day from both jobs, depleting a reserve she could not really afford to deplete. She had left work the previous Saturday, having reopened the vault, carefully, alone, and catalogued to the best of her ability what she could see without unwrapping anything. She had counted the stacks along the far wall. She had estimated their dimensions. She had photographed everything with her phone. The 3 appraisers were Dr. Carolyn Taft, a precious metal specialist from the university's materials science department who had worked with the State Historical Commission on several prior occasions. James Pelletier, a numismatist, a specialist in coins and currency, with 30 years of experience and 3 published volumes on American coinage history. And a woman named Anita Brower, who ran a gallery in Philadelphia, specializing in historical artifacts and fine decorative objects. They descended into the vault one at a time, at Margaret's insistence, with her present during each examination. Voss waited above. The county clerk made notes on a clipboard. Carolyn Taft went first. She was a tall woman with reading glasses and the unhurried manner of someone whose work had long since cured her of the expectation of surprise. She unwrapped the first object Margaret had touched, the one she had picked up and replaced, and held it under the portable LED lamp she had brought, and turned it slowly in her hands. It was a bar, rectangular, dense, with the unmistakable warm glow of yellow gold. On its surface, partially obscured by a century and a half of storage, there were stamps, a series of marks that Taft examined through a magnifying loupe, her expression focused and still. Late 19th century, she said after a long moment. The stamps are consistent with assay office markings from that period. Pennsylvania and Ohio. Assay marks, primarily. She set the bar on her portable scale. 400 troy ounces, approximately. She looked up at Margaret. That's a standard commercial bar size for the era. She reached for the next object in the stack. Margaret stood against the stone wall and breathed the dry air and watched. By the time Taft had worked through 2 full stacks, perhaps 40 objects, her movements had acquired a rhythm that was outwardly calm, and inwardly, Margaret could see, absolutely concentrated. She was not speaking much. She was recording weights, examining stamps, making notations in a small waterproof notebook. But occasionally she paused and looked at a particular object for a longer moment, and the pauses were telling. After 2 hours, she climbed the ladder and conferred with Pelletier for several minutes in a low voice, while Margaret stood a few feet away. Then Pelletier descended. He was methodical in a different way, slower, more deliberate, with the particular patience of a man who understood that the difference between a common coin and an extraordinary one is often visible only to the prepared eye given sufficient time. He worked through the leather cases on the right wall, opening each one carefully and examining the contents under a specialized lamp he had brought for the purpose. The cases held, as he explained to Margaret when he came back up, coin collections, organized, or documented, systematically assembled, not random accumulation. Someone had been collecting with intention and knowledge over a very long period of time. The oldest pieces I'm seeing, he said, making a note, are pre-revolutionary, colonial American currency, early continental issues. These are... He paused, in the careful way of a man who does not wish to be inaccurate. These are significant, Mrs. Callahan. Several pieces I've seen in the last hour I have not encountered in 20 years of practice. Anita Brower went last. She examined the wooden cabinet and the shelves on the left wall. The cabinet contained, she found, jewelry. Pieces that ranged across the same long period of time as everything else in the vault. Georgian and early Victorian gold and gemstone work. Several pieces bearing maker's marks that she photographed with a specialized camera. A few items of what appeared to be handmade craftsmanship of the highest order. Margaret climbed down one final time, After all, 3 had completed their initial assessments and stood in the center of the vault with the LED lamp Taft had left running, and looked at everything that had been partially unwrapped: the bars with their assay marks, the open cases of coins, the pieces of jewelry set out on Brower's soft examination cloth. The warm color of gold in lamplight is unlike anything else. It does not look like money, exactly. It looks older than money. It looks like the thing money was invented to approximate and fails at. It has a depth to it, a warmth, a sense of absorbed light that is not reflected but held. When she stood in the center of the vault and looked at what Augustus Harwick and the generations that followed him had put in the ground and trusted to stay there. Then she climbed the ladder and went upstairs and stood in the main room, in the winter light coming through the road-facing window, and allowed herself to breathe. The preliminary assessment meeting took place in Renata Voss's office on a Friday afternoon 2 weeks later. Margaret drove there directly from her morning shift at the grocery store, still in her work clothes, because she had not been able to bring herself to go home and change first, afraid that the act of pausing would break something she needed to keep intact. Voss had arranged the seating so that Margaret was at the head of the table, a positioning that she noted with a faint, private gratitude. Taft, Pelletier, and Brower sat across from her, each with their notes. Voss sat at the side, her legal pad open. Taft spoke first. She had the manner of a scientist presenting findings, precise, measured, without editorializing. I examined 74 gold bars in the main stack array over 2 separate visits, she said. The bars are consistent in composition, high purity gold, assay office verified, averaging approximately 94 to 95% fineness, which is standard for commercial bars of the 1850 to 1900 period. The average bar weight is approximately 400 troy ounces, with some variation. Total assessed weight for the 74 bars I examined directly is approximately 29,600 troy ounces. She paused. I was able to reach and examine approximately 60% of the total stacked objects, so extrapolating from the visible arrangement, my best estimate for the full stack inventory is in the range of 120 to 140 bars. The number hung in the room's clean winter air. Margaret did the arithmetic she had already done, more than once, in the quiet of her apartment at 2 in the morning. 120 bars at 400 ounces each. At current gold prices, which she had checked that morning on her phone in the grocery store parking lot, as she did every morning now, gold was trading at approximately $2,100 per troy ounce. The number she arrived at, even at the conservative end, was in the range of $100 million. She kept her face very still. Pelletier went next. The coins, he said, represented one of the most significant private collections of American historical currency he had encountered in his career. He did not use the word unprecedented, but he used exceptional 3 times and remarkable twice, which for a man of his evident restraint was its own kind of statement. The collection appeared to have been assembled deliberately over multiple generations, with an emphasis on rarity and condition that suggested either professional guidance or extraordinary native knowledge. Several pieces, he said, would require individual expert assessment before accurate valuation was possible, but his preliminary estimate for the collection as a whole was in the range of $20 to $35 million, with the caveat that individual rare pieces could significantly exceed proportional estimates. Antoinetta Brower's assessment covered the jewelry and decorative objects in the cabinet and on the left wall shelves. 17 pieces of significant Georgian and early Victorian jewelry. 6 maker-marked pieces she had been able to partially identify. 3 from notable Philadelphia goldsmiths of the mid-19th century, whose work was held by museums. Several decorative objects, small sculptures, decorative boxes, in gold and silver, one of which she believed to be of European origin and considerable rarity. Her preliminary estimate, $8 to $15 million, pending full authentication of the maker-marked pieces. When all 3 had finished, Renata Voss looked at Margaret. Margaret looked back at her. "What are we looking at in total?" Voss asked, directing the question to the room. Taft, Pelletier, and Brower exchanged a brief glance, the glance of professionals who have been in the same room with the same numbers and arrived at the same understanding. "At current gold prices and preliminary valuations," Taft said carefully, "and acknowledging that the full inventory has not yet been assessed and that precious metals markets fluctuate, a conservative combined estimate for the vault's contents as currently inventoried is in the range of $125 to $135 million. She paused. "With the possibility, pending full authentication of the rarer coin collection pieces and the European decorative objects, of the total reaching closer to $300 million or above." The room was very quiet. $315 million, Pelletier said, almost to himself. "Onai, if the 3 exceptional pieces I've flagged authenticate as I believe they will." Margaret Callahan, 58 years old, who had $412 in her checking account that morning, sat at the head of the conference table in a small office above a dry cleaner's on Route 12 and looked at the 3 professionals across from her who had just told her, with the careful language of people whose credibility depends on accuracy, that she had found, beneath the floor of a stone building she purchased for $8, approximately $315 million in gold, coins, and historical objects. She pressed her hands flat against the table, the way she had pressed her palm flat against the flagstone floor of the vault the first morning she had gone there. She felt the solid surface beneath her hands. She felt the weight of the room, felt the light from the window, the sound of traffic on Route 12 beyond the glass. She said, "Thank you." And then, because she could not help it and did not try to stop it, and because the room was full of people who had been in unusual situations before, and understood that the body has its own response to the extraordinary, she wept, not dramatically, not the weeping of someone falling apart, the quiet weeping of someone who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has just been given, without warning, permission to set it down. Renata Voss passed her a box of tissues across the table without comment, which was exactly the right thing to do. The weeks that followed were the strangest of her life, stranger in certain ways than the weeks after Daniel died, for because grief is at least a feeling humans are built to recognize, a known shape even at its worst. But this was something without a name, without a script, without anyone she had ever met who could tell her what came next. The legal process moved with a deliberateness that required patience she had built over 3 years of hard circumstances in quantities she would not previously have believed possible. Voss filed the discovery notification with the county. A title search confirmed no surviving Harwick heirs with standing to claim. Edmund IV had been the last, and the intestate process had terminated all remaining family claims when the county disposition was finalized. The gold bar's assay marks were cross-referenced with historical records. No theft or seizure claims were found attached to them. The coin collection was run through databases of stolen or contested property. No matches emerged. The vault and its contents, under Pennsylvania law, belonged to Margaret Callahan, who had purchased the land and the structure that stood on it, and the property therein for $8, and the assumption of $4,247 in delinquent taxes. Pelletier's 3 exceptional pieces authenticated exactly as he had believed they would. 2 were confirmed as among fewer than a dozen known surviving examples of their type. 1. A 1794 flowing hair silver dollar in near mint condition, which he had been almost unable to speak about in his usual measured tones when he called to give her the result, was assessed individually at a figure that, by itself, would have retired the balance of her hospital debt several times over. The full authentication process took 4 months. During those 4 months, she continued working both jobs. She went to the grocery store 6 mornings a week and scanned items and said good morning to customers and counted change with the same care she had always brought to it. She went to the office building 4 nights a week and mopped floors and wiped surfaces and left each room cleaner than she found it. She did not tell anyone at either job. She did not tell her neighbor Dot. She did not tell Claire. She told no one except Renata Voss, who was managing the process, and whose professional discretion was both contractual and, Margaret could see, genuinely felt. She did tell Patricia on a Sunday afternoon in March, sitting in Patricia's kitchen with cups of tea, the same setting, the same chairs, as the afternoon 6 months earlier, when she had said I bought a property, and watched her sister's expression move through concern to something close to grief. She said it the same way she had said it then, directly, without preamble. The toll house had a vault under the floor, she said. I found it in November. I've had it assessed. The contents are valued at $315 million. Patricia looked at her. Margaret met her eyes. Maggie, Patricia said very quietly. I know. That's... Patricia stopped. She looked down at her tea, then back up. Her eyes were wet. Maggie, I know. What are you gonna do? Margaret wrapped her hands around her cup. The kitchen was warm and smelled of the vegetable soup Patricia had been making when she arrived. And outside the window, the March sky was the particular soft gray that means winter is almost finished. I'm going to pay the hospital, she said. I'm going to make sure Claire's boys can go to any college they want. I'm going to restore the toll house. Properly. With people who know what they're doing. And I'm going to sleep through the night. Patricia pressed her lips together, and her expression moved through several things in quick succession. Relief, awe, the complicated emotion of someone who said you can't afford to dream right now, to a person who has just proven that dreaming, at the right moment, is the only rational act. I told you not to buy it, Patricia said. You did, Margaret agreed. A pause. I was wrong. You were worried. That's different. Patricia reached across the table and took her sister's hand. They sat that way for a long time, in the warm kitchen with the soup smell and the March sky outside the window, while the world outside continued its ordinary motion, unknowing. She was at the grocery store the following Monday morning, running a customer's items across the scanner with the same steady rhythm she had maintained for 31 months, when she heard 2 of the cashiers talking in the next lane. She caught the words, toll house, and old road, and went very still. Her hand paused on a box of cereal. On the news this morning, one of them was saying, some woman bought it for almost nothing at an auction. I heard it was like $5, the other said. $8, I think. And there was a vault under the floor. She moved her hand and scanned the cereal and smiled at her customer, who was not listening to the conversation and was looking at his phone. She continued working. Her heartbeat was elevated, but her hands were steady. It was beginning. She had known it would begin. Voss had told her. News of this nature, processed through the county record system, through the professional network of appraisers and authentication specialists, through the simple fact of paperwork filed in public offices, does not stay private. It finds its way. It travels through the small channels of a community the way water finds its way downhill, not dramatically, not in a single flood, but steadily through every available path. By the time she arrived at the office building that Tuesday night for her cleaning shift, the building supervisor, a heavy-set man named Gary, who communicated primarily in grunts and had never, in 31 months, shown particular interest in anything she did, was waiting for her at the entrance. Heard something about you, he said, studying her with the expression of a man recalibrating something he thought he understood. Probably, she said. Something about a toll house. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, slowly, as if confirming a fact he had not been sure of. Huh, he said. And then, well, you're here. I'm here, she agreed, and went inside. She mopped the 3rd floor with the same care she always brought to it, working methodically from the far end toward the elevator, the way she had always done. And she thought about the vault under the floor of the toll house, and about the cold air that had risen from it on the morning she opened it, and about the weight of the gold bar in her hands when she first picked it up and understood what it was. She did not feel, mopping that floor, that the two things were in contradiction. The floor needed mopping. She was there. She had always believed that a thing worth doing is worth doing properly, whether anyone is watching or not, whether the world knows or doesn't know what you are, what you carry, what is waiting for you on the other side of the morning. The mop moved across the tile in its steady arcs. The building was quiet around her. Outside, the March night was cold and clear, and somewhere 40 minutes away, beneath a stone floor on an overgrown road, $315 million in gold sat patiently in the dark, waiting for the woman who had found it to decide what came next. The story broke on a Wednesday morning in April, 6 days after the final authentication reports were filed with the county clerk's office and entered into the public record. Margaret had known it was coming. Renata Voss had warned her with the calm specificity of someone who had watched these mechanisms operate before. Once the paperwork is public, you have perhaps a week before someone pulls it and understands what they're reading. A local reporter, a title searcher, a curious county employee on a slow afternoon. Any of them could be the first. And once the first knows, the rest follow within hours. It was a local television station that ran it first. A segment on the evening news, the kind of story that local news was built for, improbable, verifiable, rooted in a specific place that viewers could drive past. So the anchor introduced it with the slightly theatrical emphasis that distinguishes local news from the national variety. A Milford Creek widow's $8 investment has turned into one of the most extraordinary treasure discoveries in Pennsylvania history. Margaret watched it on her phone in the parking lot of the grocery store after her morning shift, sitting in her Honda with the engine off and the heater still ticking as it cooled. The segment showed the exterior of the toll house, Someone had driven out and filmed it. The stone walls visible behind the bare branches of the oaks, the overgrown path, the rusted gate. The image was not flattering. It looked exactly like what it was: a derelict building on a forgotten road. The segment noted the tax lien auction, the $8 bid, the vault discovery, so the $315 million assessment. It did not get everything right. The reporter described the vault as a secret basement, which was not quite accurate. He said the gold had been hidden during the Civil War, which the historical timeline did not support. He got Margaret's age wrong by 4 years. He got the essential facts correct, which was what mattered, and which was what would ensure that by the following morning, every person who knew her would have seen it. Her phone began ringing before she reached the apartment. Claire called first, because Claire always called first when anything important happened, which was one of the many things Margaret loved about her daughter, that innate orientation toward her mother. So the reflex of closeness that had survived distance and years, and the ordinary drift of lives moving in their separate directions. "Mom," Claire said, and then said nothing else for a moment, which told Margaret everything about the state her daughter was in. "I was going to tell you," Margaret said. "I was waiting until the legal process was complete. I didn't want to, Mom." Again, just the word. Then, $300 million, 315 approximately, pending final market valuation at time of liquidation. A sound from Claire that was partly a laugh and partly something else entirely. "You bought it for $8. $8 and some back taxes. Mom." A third time, and now the word was doing something different. Not shock, not disbelief, but something closer to the sound a person makes when they look back at a long road and see, from the distance of where they now stand, the full shape of what it required. You drove out there every Saturday by yourself. You fixed the roof with plastic sheeting. Her voice broke slightly. You were cleaning offices at midnight. "I still am," Margaret said. "Through the end of the month, I gave proper notice." A pause. Then Claire laughed. A real laugh, sudden and helpless and bright. "Of course you did. It's the professional thing to do. Mom, you found $300 million under a floor, and you're worried about giving proper notice to a cleaning company." "I made a commitment, Claire. That doesn't change because my circumstances changed." There was a silence on the line that was full of love, the particular love of a child who has spent a lifetime watching a parent be exactly and consistently themselves, and has only now, in this extraordinary moment, fully understood what that consistency was worth. "I'm coming," Claire said. "Next weekend. I'm bringing the boys." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to." A beat. "I want them to see it. The toll house. I want them to understand what you did." Margaret looked out the windshield at the parking lot, at the ordinary afternoon light falling on ordinary cars, the ordinary movement of ordinary people going about ordinary Wednesdays, unaware that anything had changed. "All right," she said. "Come." Patricia arrived the following morning, unannounced, so with a jar of homemade jam and an expression that Margaret recognized as her sister's version of an apology, not stated directly, because Patricia was not constitutionally capable of stating certain things directly, but present in every detail of her arrival, in the jam in the early hour, and the way she stood in the doorway of Margaret's apartment, holding the jar with both hands. "I saw the news," Patricia said. "I know. You told me you found some objects. historical objects. I did tell you that. Patricia looked at her. Maggie. Come in, Patricia. I'll make tea. They sat at the kitchen table, as they always did, and Patricia turned the jam jar slowly in her hands and didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, I told you not to buy it. You did. I said you couldn't afford to dream. You said that. Another silence. I was thinking about myself, Patricia said, in the tone of someone making a confession they have rehearsed and still find difficult. About what I would have done, about what made sense from the outside. She looked up. I wasn't thinking about you. Margaret poured the tea. You were worried about me. There's nothing wrong with that. There's something wrong with not trusting you. Patricia wrapped her hands around the cup. You've always known things about yourself that I couldn't see, even when we were girls. She shook her head slightly. I should have remembered that. They sat together in the small kitchen as the morning light moved across the table, and they talked the way sisters talk when the walls between them come down. Not in the managed, careful way of the Sunday phone calls, but directly, without performance. About Daniel, about the years since, about what Margaret had felt the morning she drove past the yellow sheet of paper on the library bulletin board, and something in her, some stubborn, irrational, grieving, hopeful part of her, had said, Stop. Look. Do you know what I thought when I first saw it? Margaret said. The toll house. First time I drove up and saw those walls. What? I thought. Someone built that to last. She paused. Daniel used to say that, about old buildings. Shame nobody remembers it. Patricia was quiet for a moment. He'd have loved this, she said softly. He'd have driven me out there himself, Margaret said. First weekend after the auction, he'd have had the pry bar before I did. They both smiled, and the smile held the particular quality of grief that has passed through enough time to become, occasionally, something close to warmth. The reaction from the wider world arrived in several waves, each with its own character. The first wave was curiosity. Reporters, initially local, and then increasingly from larger outlets, who contacted Voss's office requesting statements and interviews. Voss managed these with the efficient protectiveness of someone who understood that her client's interest was served by controlled disclosure rather than spectacle. Margaret gave one interview, a single conversation with a journalist from the state's largest newspaper, conducted at Voss's office on the record, in which she said what was true and declined to elaborate on what she wasn't ready to share publicly. She said she had found the listing on a library bulletin board and recognized something in the property that others had missed. She said she had done the work herself to the extent she was able. She said she had been fortunate, and that she also believed fortune tends to find people who are paying attention. The journalist, a woman about Claire's age who had the efficient sharpness of someone who has learned to listen as much as she speaks, asked, What do you think the people who passed on it, the developers who walked away, what do you think they would say now? Margaret considered this for a moment. I think they'd say they made a sensible decision based on the information available, she said. And they'd be right. It was a sensible decision. The roof was caving in. The floors were rotted. Anyone looking at it from the outside would have said it wasn't worth the trouble. She paused. But I wasn't looking at it from the outside. The second wave was the commentary, social media, local forums, the particular ecosystem of public opinion that forms around unusual stories. The dominant note she gathered from what Voss showed her and from what Claire reported from Portland, with the weary amusement of someone who spends more time online than her mother, was something like, Of course it was a widow who'd been cleaning offices at midnight. Of course it was someone who bought it for $8 because nobody else wanted it. There was a satisfaction in this narrative, she understood. The satisfaction of a story that confirms something people want to believe is true. That persistence matters. That the overlooked and the dismissed have their moments. That the world, despite abundant evidence to the contrary, occasionally rights itself. She did not entirely disagree. But she also knew that the story, as it was being told in its simplified form, left out the years of careful attention that had preceded the finding. The reading, the research, the hundreds of miles driven, the cold Saturday mornings on a caving roof, the watching, the listening to the way things sound when you tap them, the willingness to crouch on a flagstone floor for as long as it takes. Luck, she had come to believe, is the name we give to preparation that arrived before we expected it. The third wave was the people themselves. This was the one she had not fully anticipated, though in retrospect, she should have. The neighbor who stopped her in the parking lot of her apartment building, not Dot, but a man named Frank from the second floor, whom she had exchanged perhaps 20 words with in 3 years, and said, with a directness that was not unkind, but was clearly unplanned, "I heard about what happened with you. That's something." The checkout manager at the grocery store, a young woman named Brianna, who had always been pleasant in the transactional way of people sharing a professional space, who said, on Margaret's second to last day, "We're going to miss you. I mean that." The cashiers in the next lane, the same ones she had heard talking the morning the story broke, who came to say goodbye with the particular warmth of people who are surprised to discover they feel more than they expected. And then there was Gary. She ran into Gary at the office building on her final night. He was there late, which was unusual, and she suspected not entirely coincidental. He was standing in the lobby when she came in with her cart, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has been thinking about something for days and has decided to say it despite finding the saying of it difficult. 22 months, he said. She looked at him. 31, actually. He absorbed this. Never missed a night. Once, she said. When I had the flu, I sent a note. He nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the floor, then back at her. You cleaned this place like it was yours, he said. Never cut corners. Never phoned it in. He paused. I noticed that. Margaret looked at him steadily. I know you did, she said. I could tell. He nodded again, and then did something she had not once seen him do in 31 months. He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief, the handshake of someone who means what they are saying and doesn't know another way to say it. She went upstairs and mopped the 3rd floor one final time, and she did it with the same care she had always brought to it, because she was still herself, and because the floor still needed mopping, and because she had never once believed that the quality of your attention to a thing should depend on what you expect to get from it. The first payment she made, before anything else, before she spoke to a financial planner or contacted a tax attorney or began the conversation with a preservation architect about restoring the toll house, was to the hospital. She made it by phone on a Thursday morning, calling the billing department at the same number she had called monthly for nearly 3 years to make the minimum payment that kept the account active and the interest accruing and the debt at the horizon of her life like a permanent weather condition. A woman named Sandra answered. Margaret had spoken to Sandra before. They hadn't had a personal relationship exactly, but a transactional familiarity, the kind that develops between two people who speak on the same subject for long enough. "I'd like to pay the balance in full," Margaret said. A pause. "The full balance?" "Yes, $178,400, and whatever interest has accrued through today's date." Another pause, longer this time. Sandra said, "Let me pull up the account." While she waited, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with the morning light on her hands and the coffee getting cold and the window showing a sky the particular bright blue of early April after a long winter, and she felt the weight of a thing she had carried so long it had become part of the landscape of her body, beginning to release. The way a muscle releases when it has been held, contracted for so long, you stopped noticing the tension until it goes. "All right," Sandra said, coming back on the line. "I have the account. Total balance with accrued interest is $179,214. "Yes," Margaret said. "I'll pay that." The transaction took 4 minutes. When it was finished, Sandra said, with the warmth of someone stepping briefly outside the professional frame, "Congratulations, Mrs. Callahan. Now you're clear." Margaret thanked her and ended the call, and sat for a long time in the bright, quiet apartment on Mercer Street. Clear. She said the word once, aloud, to the empty room. Claire and the boys came in late April. Her grandsons, Thomas, who was 7, and Eli, who had just turned 5, arrived with the energy of children who have been in an airplane for the first time and are still processing the miracle of it, talking simultaneously about clouds and the tiny cups of apple juice and a man in a hat who had sat across the aisle. She held them both at the airport, one in each arm, for longer than she needed to, and did not apologize for it. They drove out to the toll house on a Saturday, the 4 of them in Margaret's Honda. She had not yet bought a new car. Cobb had made a list of reasons why this could wait, and turned off the county road onto Harwick Road and followed it through the oaks until the stone building came into view. She watched her daughter's face as the toll house appeared. Claire had the expression of someone trying to reconcile a story they've been told with the physical reality it describes, because the toll house, even with its damaged roof and its overgrown path and its general air of long neglect, had something in its stone walls that communicated itself immediately, an endurance, a presence, the quality of a thing built by people who were thinking past themselves. Thomas said, "Is that it?" "That's it," Margaret said. Eli considered the building with the serious, evaluating gaze of a 5-year-old assessing something important. "It's old," he said. "Why, 176 years old," Margaret said. Eli absorbed this. "That's more than Grandpa would have been." "Yes," Margaret said simply. "It is." She took them inside. She showed them the main room, the old counter, the photograph of Augustus and Clara that still sat on the windowsill, their faded faces turned toward the pale light. She showed them the flagstones. She knelt and moved the 2 central slabs. She had become practiced at this, and lifted the iron plate and let the cool air rise from below, and watched Thomas and Eli lean over the edge of the opening with the total, unself-conscious fascination of children who have not yet learned to pretend things don't astonish them. "There's a ladder," Thomas said. "There is." "Where does it go?" down, she said, to where the gold was. She descended first, then Claire, and then the boys, Thomas confident, Eli with the deliberate care of someone whose legs are not quite long enough for the rungs, but who will not say so. The vault was empty now, cleared for the full authentication inventory, but its dimensions remained. The stone walls and the stone floor, and the low ceiling, and the orderly shelves, and the clear aisle down the center that whoever had arranged the space had left for someone to one day stand in and look. Thomas walked the perimeter slowly, running his hand along the stone of the far wall. Eli stayed close to Margaret, looking around with wide eyes. "It was all here," Claire said quietly, looking at the shelves. "All of it," Margaret said. "Stacked. Wrapped. Organized." Claire shook her head slightly. "Someone spent a long time on this." "More than one person," Margaret said. "Took more than one lifetime." She looked at the walls. "They put it here because they believed in it, because they thought it was real in a way that paper wasn't. And they were right, as it turned out." She paused. "Things built to last tend to last." Eli tugged at her hand. "Grandma," he said, with the gravity of a 5-year-old raising a matter of genuine importance, "can we have lunch?" She looked down at him. "Yes," she said, "we absolutely can." They climbed back up into the light. In June, she hired the preservation architect. His name was Marcus Webb, and he had spent 20 years restoring historic stone structures in the mid-Atlantic region. And he walked through the toll house on a warm morning with the air of a man in the presence of something he genuinely respected. He ran his hand along the limestone walls, examined the mortar joints, crouched to inspect the flagstone floor, went up to the roof with a practiced eye that took in the whole of the damage and its possibilities simultaneously. When he came back down, he said, "The bones are extraordinary. Everything structural is essentially sound. What needs work is the envelope, roof, glazing, the weatherproofing at the threshold, and the north side living quarters need full floor replacement." He looked at her. "What are you thinking for its use?" "I want it restored," she said, "to what it was. Not a museum, a living space, a place someone can use." He nodded. "That's the right call for a building like this." A pause. "Are you thinking you'll live here?" She looked around the main room. The sunlight was coming through the road-facing window in long, warm bars, catching the dust motes that drifted in the air, and the stone walls had the quality she had first noticed on the day she came here as its new owner. The quality of a space that has absorbed a great deal of time and is not afraid of more. The flagstone floor beneath her feet was the same floor it had always been. The old counter stood in its same place. The photograph of Augustus and Clara was still on the windowsill. "Yes," she said. "I think I am." Webb smiled. "Good," he said. "Old buildings need people in them. It's what keeps them alive." Construction began in August. She visited every Saturday, as she had always done, and watched the roof take shape above the north side, watched the new glazing go in at the windows, watched the careful work of people who knew how to treat stone with the respect it deserved. She brought coffee, and she asked questions. She learned, as she had always learned, attentively, without shame about what she didn't yet know. The flagstone floor in the main room was left exactly as it was. The iron plate in its center was cleaned and refitted with new hardware, and the vault below, now empty, now documented and assessed and legally resolved, was cleaned and sealed and left intact. It was part of the building, She saw no reason to pretend otherwise. The financial resolution, when it came, arrived in the form of a wire transfer from the auction house that had handled the first tranche of the vault's contents. The most liquid items, the gold bars, sold through a process Voss had managed with the methodical precision that characterized everything she did. But the number that appeared in the account Voss had helped her establish was large enough that the first time Margaret saw it on the statement, she had to read it 3 times to confirm that the decimal point was where she thought it was. She paid off the hospital first, had already done that by phone, months before this transfer arrived, drawing on her own funds while the process moved forward. Now she paid Voss, whose fees were substantial and warranted. She established the education trusts for Thomas and Eli that she had promised Claire, sized so that whatever path her grandsons chose, whatever school, whatever field, whatever ambition they were moved toward, the money would be there. She paid the back taxes on the toll house in a single lump sum, closing that account permanently. She paid off her car, which was perhaps not the most dramatic use of newly acquired wealth, but which gave her a concrete, immediate satisfaction she had not anticipated. She donated to the hospital's patient assistance fund, not because she had to, but because she had sat in that hospital for 18 months, watching other people navigate the same impossible arithmetic that had nearly swallowed her, and because she understood in a way that was physical, not abstract, what a single month's relief from that weight could mean. She contacted the County Historical Society and offered to fund a restoration of the historical records related to the Harwick Turnpike and the broader history of the county's early road network. Helen Marsh, the pleasant woman she had spoken to months earlier, was speechless on the phone for a full 3 seconds before recovering her composure and saying, with feeling, that this was extraordinarily generous. It was also, Margaret thought, the right thing to do. The history that had made the toll house what it was, that had given it its extraordinary contents, deserved to be preserved as carefully as the building itself. The coin collection, once the numismatic community became aware of its existence through the authentication process, generated an attention of its own kind. Pelletier received calls from colleagues around the country. 2 museums expressed interest in acquiring specific pieces. The auction for the collection, when it came, drew bidders from 11 countries. The final gavel on the 1794 flowing hair silver dollar, the piece Pelletier had been barely able to describe without his voice changing, fell at a figure that made the room go quiet before it filled with sound. Margaret was not present at the auction. She had chosen not to be. She read the results that evening at her kitchen table, the table in the apartment on Mercer Street, which she still lived in through the restoration of the toll house, which would not be complete until October. And she was glad the coin had found its way to a collector who understood what they had. Some things deserve to be seen. Some things deserve to be kept. The art she was beginning to understand was knowing which was which. She moved into the toll house on the 12th of October, which was not a date of particular historical significance, but which she chose because it was a Saturday, and she had always come here on Saturdays, and it seemed right to continue that. The restoration was complete in the ways that mattered, and ongoing in the ways that old buildings always are. There would always be a joint to repoint, a shutter to rehang, a drainage channel to clear before winter. She had come to understand this, not as a problem, but as the nature of the relationship. A building like this required engagement. It asked to be attended to. That was not a burden. That was an exchange. She brought her boxes from the apartment on Mercer Street. Not many, simply because she had not accumulated much in 3 years of careful living, and set them against the stone wall of the main room, the way she had set her boxes against a different wall in a different house at the beginning of an impossible year. Her kettle, her books, her coffee mug, the photograph of Daniel that she kept on whatever surface was nearest to where she slept. She set that last one on the old counter, in the place she had chosen for it, in the light from the road-facing window. She looked at the main room of the toll house, the new glazing in the windows, the repaired roof, invisible from here, but present as a fact, the way certain things are present. The way the ground is present beneath your feet even when you're not thinking about it. The flagstone floor, original and enduring, of the iron plate at its center fitted with its new hardware. The shelves on the left wall, cleaned and empty now, waiting for whatever she chose to put on them. She stood in the center of the room, the way she had stood the first time she came here, testing the floor, listening to the silence. The quality of the silence had not changed. It was still expectant, still full in the way of very old, quiet places that have absorbed a great deal of time. But it no longer felt like waiting. It felt like welcome. She thought about the people who had moved through this space before her, the toll collectors of the turnpike era, counting coins in lamplight. Augustus Harwick himself, walking these flagstones with the particular satisfaction of a man who has built something that will outlast him. The generations of the family who had maintained the vault below, visiting it periodically, adding to it, keeping it secret. Edmund IV, sitting here alone in the long quiet of his final decades, with the weight of the secret beneath his feet, unable or unwilling to give it up. She thought about Daniel, who would have put his hand on this stone wall and said, "Someone built this to last," and meant it as the highest possible praise. And she thought about herself, the woman who had driven 40 minutes each way on cold Saturday mornings, with a thermos of coffee and a tube of caulk and a stubborn refusal to agree that something was worth only what others believed it to be worth. The woman who had crouched on a cold floor and listened to the way a stone sounds when you tap it. The woman who had not walked away. She had been asked, like in the single interview she gave, what she would say to someone who thought the whole story was simply a matter of luck. She had said, "Every person who passed on that building was being sensible. The roof was bad, the floors were worse, the price was right, and the risk was real, and they made the reasonable choice." She had paused. "I made a different choice, not because I knew what was there. I didn't know. I chose it because I recognized something in those walls that I wasn't ready to walk away from. Something that had been built to last and deserved someone willing to stay." She had not said the rest, had kept it for herself, as she kept certain things. That the choice had not felt like courage at the time. It had felt like the only option available to someone who had learned, through the long, difficult education of recent years, so that standing still and waiting for something to change was its own kind of gamble, and not the better one. That the $8 had not been a bet on luck. They had been a bet on herself. She walked to the window and looked out at the November oaks, their leaves gone now, their bare branches making their familiar patterns against the gray October sky. The overgrown path was cleared. The iron gate had been rehung on new hardware and swung smoothly now, though she had kept the old iron of it, the rust-red color of something that has stood in weather for a long time and is still standing. The road beyond the gate was the same road it had always been, narrow, unpaved in this stretch, little more than a track through the countryside. No one used it as a route to anywhere anymore. It was its own destination now, or the beginning of one. She went to the kettle she had plugged in on the counter next to Daniel's photograph. She made tea in her old mug. She pulled a chair to the window and sat in the light, the same light that had fallen through this window for 176 years, on different people in different circumstances, all of them pausing here for a moment before going on. She was not going on. She was staying. That was the difference, and it felt, for the first time in a very long time, like exactly the right place to be. Outside, the oaks moved in the October wind, and the light shifted on the old stone walls, and the toll house, which had been built to last, and had lasted, and which had kept its secret through wars and seasons and generations of a family, and 40 years of solitary occupation, and 3 years of abandonment, and $8, and a woman who would not walk past, stood in the quiet of its hillside, and held the afternoon light as it had always held it. Steady, patient, enduring, exactly as it was built to be. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a life when everything that once held it together is gone. Margaret Callahan had known that silence. She had lived inside it for 3 years, and she had not pretended it was something else, and she had not stopped moving inside it. But then she had turned off Route 9 one October morning with a folded piece of paper and an $8 check and something that the reasonable voices in her life had not been able to name, and had therefore called foolish. It was not foolishness. It was the conviction, quiet, persistent, unreasonable in the way that all the most important things are unreasonable, that some things are built to last, and that the person willing to stay long enough to find out is always the one who discovers what they were built to hold. She drank her tea in the window light of the Harwick toll house on a Saturday in October, and the silence around her was whole and warm and fully, completely her own. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.